Hello, my name is Philip Totaro. I'm the founder and CEO of market research firm IntelStor. Welcome to your weekly dose of truth to power. Truth to Power examines data driven insights for the energy sector with a focus on renewables. On this week's episode, I'll dissect the costs to the U.S. offshore wind sector from the stop work orders as well as the tariffs which have been enacted in the past year. A new research note with the latest analysis from IntelStor is out this week. It covers the $1.5 billion plus of cost increases incurred by offshore wind projects due to the hostility and gross incompetence from the U.S. administration. The financial impact of the U.S. administration's stop work orders on the construction of 5 offshore wind farms in the USA have totaled more than $515 million. On top of this, the impact of the tariffs imposed by the US administration has added another 1.06 billion to the total cost as well. These ill-considered actions have driven total cost for these 5 projects to more than $28.4 billion and the average cost to more than $5 million per installed megawatt. That average cost per megawatt is substantially higher than the average cost per megawatt in Europe during the early days of the offshore wind sector. The developers ultimately bear the burden of these cost overruns, and it certainly has an impact on their margin. While Dominion Energy's coastal Virginia offshore wind project was impacted the most due to the project size of 2.6 gigawatts, they also saw the largest portion of the impact to their total project cost. The company recently reported that the total costs for the construction halt, which lasted only 25 days for them, worked out to an average of more than $9.1 million per day for a total of $228 million. That includes $5 million per day just for vessels, according to Dominion. Vineyard Wind was ultimately impacted less by tariffs and more by the stop work order, probably than they even needed to be. They waited to file their lawsuit to get their project restarted until the outcome of the first of the lawsuits from one of the other project developers was already known. While this helped them with their legal strategy, it was ultimately an extremely costly choice. IntelStor's estimate is that their decision to wait to file their lawsuit ultimately cost them more than $30 million compared to filing the lawsuit earlier and getting an earlier hearing date. This has contributed substantially to a project which was already suffering from substantial project cost overruns, with more than a $2.2 billion total cost impact from delays related to blade quality issues and repairs undertaken by General Electric for Nova and LM Wind Power. Equinor has suffered the most from the stop work orders. The impact to the total project cost was a 2.57% increase to their total project budget after the U.S. administration reneged on the deal, which ended the project halt that they enacted back in April of last year. Tariffs have added 4.4% to the cost of Revolution Wind, 4.95% to the total cost of the coastal Virginia offshore wind project, and 5.44% to the total cost of Sunrise Wind. The tariff impact on Empire Wind and Vineyard Wind was lower, but still appreciable at 2.15% and 0.58% respectively. The reason it was lower for both of them was because much of the component sourcing was already completed prior to the tariffs being enacted. The stop work orders on these 5 projects have also contributed substantially to project costs, with each developer incurring a cost increase equivalent to approximately 1.2 to upwards of 2.6% of the total project cost. Ultimately, deliberate hostility towards the offshore wind energy costs American investors money. It costs foreign investors who have put billions of dollars into the U.S. economy in foreign direct investment money. It costs American ratepayers money. And American ratepayers ultimately pay for these cost overruns via power purchase prices, which are higher than necessary. Just like Americans pay for tariffs because all of that cost increase gets passed on back to us. If you buy electricity in the United States, you are likely not happy with average prices in the past year. According to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, which has been reviewed and analyzed by IntelStor, the average residential electricity rates have jumped more than in 2025 versus 2024. Average residential rates were more than $138 per megawatt hour and are poised to continue increasing. The current U.S. administration has said since January of last year that the United States is in an energy crisis. Well, the only crisis which exists is one of the current administration's making. The offshore wind industry in the USA was poised to see more than $100 billion worth of investment with more than 60 gigawatts of capacity in the pipeline, including new auctions to be held in Oregon, Maine, and the Mid-Atlantic. In April 2025, IntelStor analyzed the potential impact of the BOEM order, initiating a review of all permits both issued and unissued to U.S. offshore wind project developers. At the time, we said a total of more than $75 billion was expected to be wiped out if the government intended to proceed as indicated. 9 months later, the industry has seen over $63.2 billion out of that $75 billion evaporate, since factories were not built, projects were not undertaken, ports were not upgraded, and R&D budgets were completely eviscerated. If the industry had been allowed to progress, it would have been well on its way to creating an industry segment worth over $1 trillion by 2035. One could certainly contend that an impact at that level contributes to American energy dominance. $1 trillion will certainly open a lot of eyes. In the meantime, the net effect of the government shutdowns and tariffs is that these 5 projects will now take an average of more than 12.3 years to see a net positive return on capital. This is an increase of more than 2.3 years from IntelStor's previous analysis, which had the average payback time frame of just under 10 years for all 5 projects which are under construction. So where does the industry actually go from here? Well, as we've been saying for a long time, the developers better get their projects built as quickly as they can to try and stave off any additional attempts by the U.S. administration to regroup and try again at stopping them from finishing construction. The deliberately malicious claim of a phony national security impact of these offshore wind projects was the government's strongest angle of attack in trying to stop the construction. It failed, at least for now. Any subsequent attempts to quash the construction or operational permits issued by the U.S. government can only get weaker from here, but that doesn't preclude the U.S. administration from trying. The fact that all 5 projects have been allowed to continue construction doesn't mean that the U.S. offshore wind industry is out of the proverbial woods yet either. Everyone's been focused on the construction permits, but there are also the operational permits to consider. These claims of a national security impact are likely to make their way back into court cases in which the developers fight for the right to operate their projects, not just construct them. The federal district court judges who ruled to overturn the construction stop work orders have said in their rulings that the permit to construct had gone through rigorous review, including by the Federal Aviation Administration and the U.S. Navy for radar or sonar interference, as well as any other national security concerns of the United States Department of Defense. These judges all concluded that there was no need to stop the construction of the projects based on any national security rationale, either publicly known or unknown. However, the judges also pointed out that any kind of radar and sonar interference, for example, would be seen as a more prevalent issue for commercial operations of offshore wind farms, as opposed to the impacts of crane vessels and offshore wind turbines, which are mainly static during the construction phase. Prevention of commercial operations of these projects could see the USA stuck with 5 offshore wind projects with more than 5.8 gigawatts worth of capacity that cost more than $28 billion to build, but have nothing to show for it. Any attempt to interfere with commercial operation by the U.S. administration will likely trigger another round of court cases to allow the project developers to flip the switch and provide power to the grid, which is desperately needed. Throughout this entire process, these European developers that have been building these projects have been extremely polite in the face of these insults and attempts at bullying from the U.S. administration. They've maintained civility all along with an expectation that disputes like this can be resolved with negotiation and compromise. To put it another way, and to use a thoroughly Western euphemism, I guess, offshore wind developers in the U.S. have been bringing lawyers to a gunfight. And despite the fact that they've been winning the cases, The real problem is that these delays are obviously adding substantially to the cost of the projects in the meantime. While the developers still have faith in the rule of law, which it seems for now still appears to be hanging on by a thin thread in the United States, the developers don't seem to have grasped these guerrilla warfare tactics being employed by the current US administration to try and stop offshore wind. Offering to invest in the United States to create jobs hasn't worked. States agreeing to buy more natural gas hasn't worked. Foreign countries being leveraged into buying more liquefied natural gas also hasn't worked. And a negotiated settlement back in May of 2025 for Empire Wind 1 to proceed did nothing to prevent the government from claiming these national security concerns were, again, just cause to stop the construction of a project that had a previous agreement in place, which the government reneged on. At the end of the day, when the US administration is clearly acting in bad faith and not honoring the agreements previously made by the government of the United States of America, regardless of whether or not it was a differently flavored political administration, you can't have a basis for a good faith negotiation when you aren't willing as an institution of the United States government to honor agreements previously made and permits previously issued. The current administration has attempted to delay the projects in an effort to drive up the costs so that the developers themselves pull the plug, making the developers look like they did it of their own volition and alleviating the government from seeming like they're the bad guy. Foreign developers will get absolutely nowhere by continuing to capitulate to the orders issued by the US administration in bad faith. Their costs will go up, their margins will go down, investors will lose confidence, and American ratepayers will ultimately be the ones who suffer. And if the US administration insists on actively undermining what has the potential to be a trillion-dollar industry, then they owe the American taxpayers and American electricity ratepayers an explanation as to why this government wants Americans to wait longer to get more power and pay more for the electrons, which are the same regardless of how they're made. Certainly, this self professed world's smartest businessman who occupies the Oval Office can explain to Americans how higher electric bills, loss of jobs, and an economic wipeout of billions is a good thing for everyone. And if he can't, then maybe he shouldn't be in the position he is. Thank you for joining me this week. I'm Philip Totaro, and this has been your weekly dose of truth to power. Follow us on IntelStor's YouTube channel as well as your favorite audio platforms. And visit www.intelstor.com to join more than 250,000 subscribers to our renewable energy data solutions. A full analysis of the current state of the U.S. offshore wind market is available to IntelStor Research Note subscribers. And you can register today for the next Wind Summit event in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Visit www.windsummit.org and join hundreds of your industry colleagues to discuss all the latest trends in O&M. We hope to see you there.